Greetings all, BWS2K here. Today we're going to talk about something different. We're going to cover an actual build that someone made using Cortex Prime. It's called Cortex Lite. It is a very short, very solid, very basic build that you can, after you've become familiar with it, you can add on or subtract and take away all mods and sets and things from the larger Cortex Prime book. So let's zoom through it real quick. It's about 20 pages, give or take. Like this counts as page one, table of contents page, and then there's some appendices that have some really awesome things. So we're just going to walk through it real quick. If you are not familiar with Cortex Prime at all, or if you are thinking about getting Cortex Prime, this can be a great place to help you make up your mind about if it might be for you. So there is a bit of a primer here on how Cortex actually works. So you do not need Cortex Prime for this. So there's a bit of a page or two about how the foundational parts of Cortex. And then it goes on to describe more of the build, which, as I said, is a pretty solid basic build. A lot of folks start, even if they don't do it intentionally, a lot of folks start with something that pretty closely resembles this, and then through play testing or whatnot, they'll customize it even more. So let's take a quick look. We've got a section on traits and how traits and what die we use or what dice we use in Cortex. So just a bit of a primer on that, and sort of a quick example of like a character sheet, really basic character sheet, what it might look like and how that works. And then talking about the rolling and keeping your effect die and having a total and that sort of things. Opposition, how opposition works. The GM, there's some notes for the GM as well. And I have things highlighted in here because I actually have two purposes for this video. One is to show off an awesome creation. It's really cool to be able to spotlight someone, but also it's something that I think I'm going to be using in the future. So I've highlighted some things that are that are different from Marvel Heroic, which is what I typically use. Basically, everything you see that's highlighted is a reminder to me that I have to remember to make a change from my normal gaming, which and I know I'm going to forget, but that's okay. So that's what the highlight is for. It's not necessarily important information for newcomers or anything. It's just I wanted to mark it up as reminders. And if you are familiar with my channel, if you watched my other videos before, you're familiar with Marvel Heroic, some of the things you'll see highlighted, like for instance, we've got, excuse me, taking a sip of my water there. We've got tests, right, highlighted because tests aren't really a thing in Marvel Heroic. You could technically do it. Opposition, you compare your rolls total to theirs, and the higher roll succeeds. The player who rolls first sets the bar for how difficult the opposition's roll should be, so that player wins ties. That's different from Marvel Heroic, right? Because usually the action is what wins ties. You have action and then the reaction, the action player wins the ties. But in here, it's different. So anyway, so that's what the highlights are for. It's not necessarily something that first timers would need to pay attention to, though it can be nice. There are some nice things, like right here, for instance, in this very first piece about your total. This is after rolling, you add two of the die results together for your total. So if my highest rolls were a 7 on a D8 and a 3 on a D6, I'd probably want to add those two together for a total of 10. And I really appreciate the probably there, because there are times where you might not want to have the largest total. You might instead take a smaller total but have a bigger effect die. And you'll understand that a little bit more as we read through here. But I really appreciate that language. And I also appreciate this down here. Your total tells you whether the story goes your way. Your effect die tells you how far it goes, which I like that succinct way of thinking about what a roll actually means. Okay, so we've got GM stuff, we've got tests. Tests are basically, other games would call them other systems would call them skill checks. It's, how to open a door, how to get past a guard, things like that aren't going to take a lot of rolling back and forth. It's just, can you do this? And if you do, you succeed, and if you don't, you fail, and whatever that task might happen to be. It talks about action order here, which is sort of the default order of play around the table, and then stepping up and stepping down dice. Notably, when you step up, so D12 is the largest die that you can have in Cortex. If anything you have steps up that die, so if you have an SFX that says step up your effect die when you're doing this thing, and you end up with a D12 effect die, you keep that D12 effect die, but then you add in an extra D6. So you kind of essentially start over again on another die, bumping that up. And then consequently, or not consequently, but conversely, when you step down a D4, it disappears. So both of those things are things that can happen depending on the dynamics at play in them. A nice note with some links about session 0 and safety tools, which are really important, because again, people play Cortex in different ways, but in my opinion, I'll say that first maybe, it's really meant to be collaborative, creative storytelling. That's kind of how all of this stuff works best. You can do it other ways, but the way that it is meant to be used and the way that it is meant to support is that collaborative, creative storytelling. And so this idea of having safety tools and this idea of being on the same page before you even start and having frequent check-ins and even the action order, right? It's choosing who goes. It's a very collaborative experience. Every game that I've run with Cortex, whether it's Marvel Heroic or something else, that's the vibe we aim for. I as the GM am not your enemy, and when you fail a dice roll, it is not the worst thing ever. It just means things get more exciting, more dramatic, and there's a chance for unexpected twists in the story. So yeah, okay, I won't drone on too much about that, but it's a nice primer, right? You're only 5 pages in, really 4 pages, right? And you've got pretty much everything you need to know. And then there's a section on effect dice, which gets a little bit more detailed, explaining the you keep 2 dice for your total, you add those numbers up, but then you have that third die, which is your effect die. And it talks about that. It talks about assets, which are a big piece of Cortex and a big piece of Cortex Lite here, and how to recover stress, complications, no D4 complications. If you get a complication, again, if you're rolling and somebody deals stress to you, that is their effect die is a D4, you don't receive a D4, you receive a D6. If it ever steps down from a D6, it's not a D4 anymore. And the kind of under the hood thinking there, generally speaking, is a D4 has a 25% chance of rolling a 1, which is what we call a hitch. You can see hitches right over here. And hitches are basically dice that you can't use. They're not utterly useless. It's always worth rolling, even if you think you might get a hitch. But because there's a 25% chance that it's going to be a 1 and only a 25% chance that it's going to be its maximum, which is a 4, it's not a super helpful die for the player typically to be, for anyone to be using for themselves. So typically it is not uncommon for people to say, or for builds to say, you know what, we're not doing D4 stress. It doesn't make any sense. Okay, being taken out, which is not necessarily that your character has been, they're not necessarily dead, but in terms of their influence on the scene, it's done. They're knocked out, or they're trapped, or they're utterly ineffectual in the rest of the scene. Plot points. This is the meta currency, which does differ from Marvel Heroic in quite a few ways. So this is certainly one of the areas that I'm going to have to pay attention to when I run my Cortex Lite game. But it explains them here, and this is not the only 4 things that you can do. There are many other things, and those become those are called out moving forward. Talking about SFX, some people struggle with, but they're basically just the extra, it's the icing on the cake, so to speak, or the sprinkles on the icing on the cake, right? It's the nice twists. I think the Cortex Prime Handbook describes them as exceptions to the rule. So, things are going along, and everything is great, and you've got the flow going, and all of a sudden someone has an SFX that says, actually, that doesn't happen that way for me, or actually, I can do that, or actually I have the ability to reverse that, or something. It's that little extra twist, right? Or exception, or something like that. And then again, talking about there at the bottom, there's always an effect. Every roll always has a minimum of 1 D4 effect die. So if you roll, for instance, 3 dice and one of them rolls a 1, you can't use that die. So you only have 2 dice. So those 2 dice get added together for your total, and then you just have a magical D4 default. It comes out of nowhere. Same thing happens if you have 3 dice and you roll 2 hitches, by the way. The 1 die that you can use is your total, and then you get a D4 as well. Some stress. So the 4 stress tracks used in Cortex Lite are damaged, demoralized, enthralled, and exhausted, which covers pretty much all the bases you would need, but then there are complications that you can make. So which one of these represents being all webbed up, right? Let's say our friendly neighborhood Spider-Man has webbed us all up. Which one of these? Well, it could be exhausted. It's probably not damaged. It might be demoralized if you were sort of thinking of giving up, or enthralled in the sense that you're distracted. But it could also just be a complication saying all webbed up D8, which is just not one of the stress tracks. It's a complication. And you can do, it's pretty much simultaneous. In fact, stress tracks are essentially standardized complications, okay? But sometimes you have something that happens like being all webbed up that doesn't fit nicely into these, and you think, okay, we'll call it as its own thing. We'll make it separate. So you can see right there, it kind of explains that, right? When you fail a test, this is a good rule that I like. When you fail a test, you take d6 stress, and the opposition is going to choose that kind of stress. So there's this note that says in games where players are likely to take lots of stress from other sources, like a superhero game with frequent fights against villains, the GM is likely better off setting this rule aside, which is a nice nod to the fact that sometimes if you're doing a lot of rolling and a lot of back and forth, and there are other things going on that will earn you stress, then it may be worthwhile to set this aside and just have it maybe use it in some scenes, but it's not necessarily the default. But generally speaking, when you fail a test, you fail to pick the lock, you get frustrated. Well, okay, so maybe that's demoralized. You fail to sneak across the bridge, and you've been spotted by the guards, so that's maybe enthralled. So on and so forth. So you take a little bit of stress. And of course, that D6 will step up. If you already have, let's say, D8 enthralled stress, and you take D6 enthralled stress, then that D8 that you have just steps up once to a D10. So now you're really enthralled. Okay, moving on, how to recover stress, which is, and in recovering complications, you do basically the same way. The traits that we use, there's a nice walkthrough, but it starts with distinctions, of course, because distinctions are kind of the heart of Cortex. They're the features of your character that aren't as simple as super strong or flies or sword or something like that. They're core components. There you go. Friendly neighborhood protector, nerdy high school student, constant wisecracked, fiery temper, reformed assassin. They're descriptions or attributes or characteristics of your character that are like the taglines or how to describe them. And then you've got a little bit of a breakdown there if you're kind of lost and you want some suggestions. The first one can be about their background, the second one can be about their belief or motivation, and the third one can be like a catchphrase or something about a personality quirk or whatever. And then there's an appendix called Distinction Builder, which actually you can roll randomly, which when we get to that, I'll show you. It's really cool. Hindering, all distinctions have this option, this SFX hinder, roll this distinction as a D4. So instead of a D8, you roll it as a D4. And when you choose to do that, you get a plot point, because again, a D4 is not really much help. So you're essentially nerfing yourself and very likely to roll a hitch that you can't use at all, but you get a piece of the meta currency for that. Attributes are one of the trait sets. So we have distinction, we have attributes, and physical, mental, social. It's just 3. They're pretty vanilla. They work in pretty much every situation, but you can customize as you play or as things go along and you think, oh, nobody's really using their mental attribute very much. Maybe we want to break that down or we want to swap it out for something else. A lot of what you see here, Cortex Prime in its heart is modular, and this is a build, but that doesn't mean that you have to stick solely to this build. You can introduce new components, swap them out, especially if you have the Cortex Prime handbook and you don't see something in Cortex Lite and you think, oh, we could really use resource dice or relationships or trait statements or something like that. And you can slot that in very easily. It's all modular. We have attributes, we have roles as well. The scholar, scoundrel, scout, soldier, speaker. And it's really up to you which applies. If you're sneaking past guards, it could be scout because you're all about stealth, but it could be soldier in that maybe sneaking past soldiers, you have an idea of what they're going to be doing. You can predict their routes and so on. It could be scoundrel, right? For being a thief and breaking in and stuff. So it's up to the player what they want to use to get through a certain situation. And one of the things that happens in Cortex fairly often is, or I should say one of the questions that happens in the Discord often is people will ask, what happens if I just keep using the same dice pool in every circumstance? Like if I want to use my best attribute and my best roll all of the time, there's nothing against that. That's fine. It doesn't break the rules. It might make your gameplay a little bit flat. And then as you feel more comfortable, you start to tease out different ideas of, oh, I'm always using my speaker because I'm always talking to people, but what if the moment, could the moment be more dramatic if I didn't say anything? Or what if I relied on this piece of my background or so on and so forth? And, it gets exciting. But there's nothing wrong if you're using the same dice pool over and over again. It doesn't break it. Specialties. Specialties are freeform. There's a lot of examples here, but they are basically exactly what it sounds like. They're specialties. They're little niche things that your character is particularly good at that aren't covered in a more general sense, like you've got sword play, shotguns, plasma rifles. So your soldier might be used when you're fighting, right? So maybe it's your physical soldier. But if you happen to have a sword, well, you get to add physical soldier and sword play into your pool when you are fighting with a sword, and so on. Signature assets. So signature assets are like a step above assets in that they aren't just things created in the moment or things that might be useful or applicable. These are things which are innately tied to your character in a more permanent way. It doesn't mean they can't come and go. It doesn't mean they can't be changed. But if we're talking swords, so I'm a soldier in the town guard, and I have a sword, and okay, sure. That could be a signature asset, right? But if it's a signature asset, it's probably not called sword. It's probably like my grandfather's sword that, my grandfather was in the town guard and my father was in the town guard and I am. So it's like a legacy sword, or town guard shield or something. Like it's usually something special, something specific, a little bit more fancy, but it can be basic. It can absolutely be basic. So the sword, is it the Sword of Eternia? Is that what He-Man's sword is, right? So like it would be something a little bit more special than just any old sword that you could pick up off the ground, or any old shield or piece of armor, or it's not just any old cat. It's what's my cat Snowball, right? That's the example they have right here, my cat Snowball. So they break it down: things, creatures, places, people, and then the other category. And other is anything that doesn't fit into the other ones. It could be a power or an ability or a specific feature of your character, any of those things. And then SFX and limits. So a little bit about SFX, which we've kind of talked about, and limits. Limits are essentially the opposite of SFX. They're things about your character that are specific that can be used against you. For instance, this first one says, I burn the candle at both ends. It says, take exhausted D6 and earn a plot point. And then it's the... I don't see it, but at any rate, it's in a certain circumstance. If you're low on plot points, or if you happen to be in a situation where it feels narratively appropriate, you could sort of activate or trigger your limit and get a plot point out of that to take some stress. And there might be, I'm making this up in my head, but you might be in a situation where you have a character that is able to take the stress that they have and give it to someone else. Okay, so like sort of the dice trick, the mechanic, the little tech that you've got is such that you can take when you have a wound, maybe you're a mage or something, when you have a wound, you can inflict it on someone else, heal yourself and inflict it on someone else. So having stress for you is actually not typically or a terribly bad thing, because then you know that you're going to be able to get rid of it. So you've got kind of a loop there of taking damage, inflicting that damage, taking that damage and getting meta currency, and then inflicting that damage on someone else, and you've got the meta currency to keep things flowing. So again, failures are not necessarily the worst. Taking stress just is not necessarily the worst. It's all recoverable. It just makes things more dramatic. If you've got stress or complications, your opposition uses that against you. So if I have an arrow in my knee, to use the incredibly cliche example, if I have an arrow in my knee, D6, that means my opponent is going to get to add that D6 to their pool. So it's something that's helping them out. But that just means that the circumstances are going to be a little bit more exciting. So milestones, this is how we have character growth in Cortex Lite. It's one of the options in the Cortex Prime handbook. And explicitly called out here, 1 XP is something that you can do once per beat, which is basically once per turn. Could be several times in a scene. The 3 XP level is something that you can only hit once per scene, and then 10 is once per session, however long your sessions happen to be. I would not say that you have to absolutely stick by that, in the sense of you might hit your 10 XP at the beginning of the session. And so if you have a 5-hour session with a dozen scenes, it may make sense in that game for the GM, for you, once you hit that 10 XP early, for the GM to say, okay, well, let's take 5, let's pick a new one, and then maybe by the end you hit that other 10 XP. But ideally that 10 XP is only once per session, because it should be so capstone. It should be so big that that's your moment for that session. And so there really isn't a lot of I should say it this way. That's ideally, but like everything, it's slottable, it's customizable, it's modular, it's changeable. And then between sessions, you can spend the XP. So by default, these 2 examples here are milestones that you would start with pretty much any character. And look at them. You earn 1 XP when you recover D8 or D10 stress, which, again, we just talked about. Sometimes having stress is a good thing. Maybe you want stress because you want to recover from it, because you want to get XP. And you can do it as many times in a session as you want. And this other 1 XP is when you earn a plot point from Hinder, or from another SFX or limit. So you're literally growing through the adversity of having stress and complications and getting rid of them, right? So it's in reinforcing the core game mechanics. It's rewarding the dramatic and the risk-taking nature of the stress and the complications, and it's all good things, right? And then it goes from there. Evolving characters. Now we get into well, okay, yeah, right. Spending. So this is how you can spend XP. The more expensive things, the bigger things to do, obviously, are more expensive. So figure in one session, let's say you hit this once or twice. The 1 XP, you hit the 3 XP maybe only once, and you hit the 10 XP, right? So that's 14. Let's call it like 16, right? If you have 16 XP, you can upgrade a D6 roll to a D8, which is nice, or you can upgrade an existing D8 specialty or signature asset to a D10, or you can add a new SFX. That's powerful, but you could also do this over here. Up to a maximum of 5, you can start the next game session. You only start with 1 plot point normally, but you could start with up to 5 plot points if you spend 5 XP. That's really powerful, starting with a nice wealth of meta currency. So, a section for GM rules, which is nice. Always nice to call that out. We've got scene distinctions, and is this what I was looking for on limits? No. All right. I read a lot in preparation for this video. I may have read it on a different document. I was thinking there was something specific about GMs triggering your limits as well, which doesn't seem to be here, but that is a thing that can happen anyway. The GM can say, hey, you've got this limit. What was that? I burned the candle at both ends. The GM could say, hey, your character has been on this forced march for a long time, and it makes sense for me to sort of activate this limit on your character to take exhausted D6. And then you would have that dialogue, because you could essentially, technically, as a player, say, no, I don't want to do that. And then the GM might say, well, you're going to get D6 exhausted, right? But ideally it would be, oh yeah, that's a great idea, GM. Let's do that, and I'll take the plot point, right? But I don't quote me on that, because I'm not seeing it in this. So maybe it wasn't in this that I read it. But regardless, the GM plot points work a little bit differently, but it's not too difficult to understand. And then the opposition. So let's camp on this for a little bit. If you are new to Cortex, then there's a lot of things that can be difficult for somebody to transition to that are different from other games. So I can easily imagine if I'm a soldier, if I'm He-Man, right, and I'm going up against Skeletor, I can understand that Skeletor has a character sheet that looks like mine, and it has all the different attributes and so on. But I'm not necessarily fighting Skeletor every single session. I might be fighting some acid pits around Snake Mountain or something. And that wouldn't make sense to have an acid pit that has the same character sheet as me. So a lot of the opposition is going to be what is essentially pools of dice. And the nature of those pools of dice differs a little bit. There's a couple different types, a couple different brands in terms of how they're represented and in terms of how they function. But you've got challenge pools, which are kind of at the top, so to speak. They're not necessarily, they can be representative of a person, but it's mostly a task. I think in the Tales of Xadia primer, I think there was a challenge pool that had to do with like giant spiders or something like that. So it was like a horde of spiders or a group of spiders that you had to overcome. And it is up to you how you overcome that challenge. So if it's an acid pit, you might describe your character as using a set of attributes and assets and so on to try to climb out. Somebody else might say, well, I've got armor, and hopefully my armor can resist this, and they build a die pool for that. There's no one way to beat it. It's just that if you succeed, excuse me, I have to mute my mic. Okay, sip on my water. I had to clear my throat and didn't want to put that into all y'all's ears. So it's this idea that however it is that you want to resist or overcome that challenge pool is valid, within reason, as long as it works at the table, everyone's in agreement. And then you are, when you succeed at that, whatever it happens to be, whether it's the climbing or the armor, you're reducing that challenge pool. You're taking dice out of that challenge pool, so that challenge is slowly being overcome. It's becoming less powerful. It's becoming less significant until you overcome it entirely. And it can itself inflict, it gets its own turn, so it can actually do something. The GM gets to determine, yeah, okay, the climbing is fine, but that armor, I'm really going to target that player. So let me roll the challenge pool, and maybe there's some specific SFXs on the challenge pool or something. A step down from that and this is me saying a step down from that, is a crisis pool, which is not exactly as grandiose as a challenge. It's not quite as, it's not probably going to take up as much time. Like you can see here on the challenge pool, 3d6 challenge pool will probably be quick and easy, while a pool of, what is that, 6d12s is likely to be long and difficult. A 3d6 is, maybe it's going to take a round of play, depending on how many players you have. Even as a solo player, if I'm up against a 3d6 challenge pool, it's probably only going to take me a couple turns to get through. This 6d12s, that's probably the feature of the session. That's a huge thing. They're not only many dice, so that would take a lot of time, but they're also really large dice, which means you're going to spend a lot of time whittling them down, versus the d6s will go pretty easy. And so if you've got 3 or 4 players, a 3d6 challenge pool may not even make it an entire round. Maybe not everyone even gets a turn, which can be cool in itself because, excuse me, sorry, I didn't mute my mic for that one. It can be cool on its own because it can actually be an opportunity for you to have your players, somebody can really shine. Somebody can be really supportive, making assets and giving them to that player and sort of doing the background role, while others might be taking the opportunity to recover. Hey, I'll let you guys figure out the acid pit. I'm just going to kind of like cling to the wall here and try to catch my breath or something like that. Versus, like I say, that larger one is going to, it's probably the main feature of the session. So the step down from that is crisis pools, which still have some play. They can still inflict stress and they still kind of do stuff back and forth, but they're a little bit lower grade. Mobs are a dice pool that represents like the spiders, or it could be a horde of people. With Marvel Heroic, in the breakout scenario, a mob is the inmates that break free. Again, you can see these are all dice pools. So I'm like, well, when do I make it a mob? What do I do if I make it a crisis pool? It's really in terms of how it's being presented, really. They all function in a similar, though not identical, fashion. It's how you want to convey that narrative component. And then bosses, which are essentially a dice pool, but it's one person. So here you've got 3d10. This represents getting into the palace, presumably the Wasteland Warlord's Palace. You've got 3d8s here. This is a hobgoblin horde, but you've got 4d6 here. This is an inspector. So yes, it is ultimately just dice pool, but you can see they can add in different dice for different things that are happening in the moment. This one has an SFX, and so on. So that's it. That's the core of the book. Is 25 pages, really 24 if you don't count the table of contents page, and that covers everything. It's great. It's a great primer. It's a quick read. It's very well set up and orchestrated and formatted is the word I was looking for. But then there are some appendices. So there's one about a distinction builder, which is fantastic. And I built one last night, and I got a background. So these would be my 3 distinctions: a background of a zealous fugitive, a personality of logical vigilante, and then a catchphrase of lead from the front. And like just seeing that, you can be like, oh, okay, I kind of have an idea of who this character is already, without even looking at the rest of the character sheet. But it's neat. It's like a table that you roll on, and it might get old after a while, but if you're brand new, it's a good place to start. Or if you're just looking for like an NPC, and you don't want to do the rest of the stuff, you might just do a set of 3 distinctions, or maybe just 1 distinction. Who do you run to? Something has gone a little bit different than you had planned as the GM, which really, I think this is the document that says you should, well, I won't look it up, but I think this is the document that says that you play to find out. So you may not have a plan of who's in the inn, who the innkeeper is, but your players want to go to the inn. So you might take a second and roll up a quick distinction to describe the person at the front counter. And it kind of helps that moment happen more organically. You can kind of build around that random stuff. And then you have some sample SFXs, which are great sample SFXs to get you started. It's a good array. And then once you've done it enough, once you have an idea of the back and forth in the play, it inspires you to kind of customize and make your own. For instance, push through it, right? Before you roll a dice pool, including scout or soldier, spend a plot point to recover damaged and step up physical for that roll. Take exhausted d6 stress if the roll succeeds, or d8 if it fails. So it's this idea of taking yourself and putting yourself in a situation where you're kind of gritting your teeth and pushing through it, and using your physical attribute, like your brawn, but it's tuckering you out. Right? So this ties in really well with that burning the candle at both ends XP, right? Because now you have some exhausted stress and now you can recover it and earn an XP from it. Like you learn those loops, but then you're like, well, my character doesn't really use scout or soldier very often. I'm a scholar, but like, okay, so instead of push through it, maybe it's like harangue the multitudes, right? Like you're or chatterbox or something like that. And it's this idea that you're just being so eloquent and so overly wordy, and you end up taking like enthralled stress because you're distracted by this really cool thing that you were talking about or something like that. And it's the same idea, right? Like you can kind of model a new SFX based on the SFXs, and you grow and you learn, and that's kind of the really awesome process. And then some sample milestones, again, which are all excellent, other than those first two that you kind of start with, and will in the same way inspire new, hopefully new milestones. And then you got some links, the main Cortex site, you've got the Tales of Xadia, which is a very solid build, but it is a full color book and as a whole thing. I think I will say this, the Dragon Prince build is, I watched almost the entirety of the first episode of Dragon Prince, and that is my experience with Dragon Prince, other than having run the primer, like the basic module, the free primer. I think I ran it 3 times, and we had good times, and it was really just kind of like me looking at the suggested opposition and using it, and then being like, okay, so this is what's happening, and if anything in here breaks the lore, then please tell me as the GM, and we'll figure out, how to unsay what I just said. But moving forward, I'm going to rely on you all to role play and fill in that side of things. But I will absolutely run the game and take care of dice pools and things and teach you how to play and that sort of stuff. And it was really great. And that's what I like about Cortex. It's that collaborative nature, which is really just excellent. And then you have a link to the Discord, which is a fantastic place to be. And Zine. So Zine is, or zines, I hope I'm saying that right, are like the magazines, right? Get it? But for Cortex, which are a lot of resources, which you will see on this channel, I think next time or in the near future, because I do want to pull from some of them as well. But they are a great place, or a great resource to have as well. So that's Cortex Lite. And then I will show you, this is the character file. It's very nice, and you get it in the same place as the Cortex Lite, and lots of room, lots of things to track, good links there at the bottom if you're doing electronic stuff, but very usable, and again, very customizable. If you're working electronically, you can edit as you need to, Photoshop or whatever. But if you're working, if you're printing out this thing, it's not like it's super busy. Plenty of room to add in extra notes. You could write on the back and that sort of stuff. So that is what I wanted to show off today and feature today. Let's zoom all the way to the back. That is all I have to say about it. If you have any thoughts, questions, comments, or observations, you can throw them in the comments section. Otherwise, we're going to bring this video to a close. We'll put a link in the description for where you can get this resource. And it is a pay what you want. So don't let that stop you from giving it a whirl. And like I said, especially if you're considering the Cortex Prime Handbook, which I know can be pricey, this can be a great place to start for a couple bucks or for free if that's where you're at. Pay what you want is pay what you want. Pay what you're able, right? So, all right, awesome. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Excelsior.